Welcome back to the last vestiges of Cameron Ray's inaugural Take Caesars at Palace by the Balls event.
Yes.
My poor little buddy here is not feeling very well.
No, that's not helping.
He's had a rough night, but he's a soldier. He's picked himself up. We did hope to have Jay David here, but he's gone AWOL. I think with a hooker. I'm not exactly sure, but
that's legal here, right?
In Pahrump, about an hour out of here it is.
All right.
So we're going to try and come up with something intelligent to say. We're not sure what.
No. We haven't decided yet.
We were going to jump into the spa bath with Ryan and get some bubbles going, but...
that reminds me, when you and I were in the bubble bath earlier, I feel like, I was telling you about this, I feel like I owe you an apology. Ever since I can remember, whenever I've had friends, and I consider you a friend, I've always...
Keep your hand in, that's fine.
I've always cut people's names short. I know your name is Cameron, but in my head... at some point, I just started calling you Cam. I don't know if that's good, bad. Okay, so I just wanted to apologize.
What's your full name?
Just Ray.
Ray Bear?
Total lack of imagination. On my website it is, but no.
You can call me Cam.
Okay. All right. Just
so what I had planned to talk about in this session is to expand a little bit. You know, we sometimes on the podcast we talk about what we've learned from these guys by studying their histories and how we can apply that to contemporary politics and what's going on in the world today. I thought maybe we could touch a little bit on that and see where it goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, over to you.
Okay. Well, the question you were posing earlier was, is America an empire? And if you ask the average American, they're going to stop you right there and go, no, we're all about, we're a representative and we're all about peace and love. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. But I mean, if you actually take 2 seconds and think about it, I mean, we have troops in other countries. We have huge corporations in America who employ a lot of people, don't pay them very much to make goods, to sell. And our foreign policy affects a lot of different nations. So if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, so is American empire? We don't like to acknowledge it, but that's just the way it is. I think we are. And from World War I and World War II, Europe is used to taking their lead from us. So if that doesn't make us an empire, I don't know what does. Or empire-esque.
I think we had somebody on the show, one of the authors or one of the academics at some stage, when I brought up the concept of the American empire, and he said, well, they don't have an emperor, so they can't be an empire. I think what your definition is of an empire is important here. Obviously, America doesn't have an emperor or a king.
Right. Donald Trump, actually.
Well, yes. Yeah. And it's not actually Trump. Most people don't know. It's actually his hair that is in control of...
It controls everything else.
Yeah, it's actually an alien that's sitting on top of him.
It talks to him. I gotcha.
Okay, so the British Empire, Britain did have a monarch. But that's, normally what we're talking about with an empire, it's got nothing to do these days in a modern context with having a king or an emperor. It's about... what is your agenda for the world? What are your ambitions for the world?
Yeah,
and I think it makes sense that major powers. Let's call the United States a major power.
Right.
Major powers want. It makes sense that a major power wants to control as much of the activity around the planet as possible, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Alexander. Why did Alexander go to Persia? Well, he wanted, in part, to get revenge on Persian incursions into... It's nice, Persian incursions. Can you say that 5 times fast?
I can't say anything right now.
Yeah, Persian incursion, Persian incursion, Persian incursion, Persian incursion, Persian incursion. That's not bad. Persian incursions into Greece several centuries earlier. But, I think that's probably bullshit. I think the real reason was a combination of... He wanted to grow his empire because the bigger... region you can control, the more access to the wealth of those lands that you have. And also you create a bigger buffer zone between your country and your enemies.
The next enemy.
Countries, right? Exactly. So it's harder for them to get to you if you have, your armies, or at least armies that are friendly to you in this biggest perimeter possible.
Right.
Caesar, why did Caesar conquer Gaul? Similar reasons. He wanted to, get access to the wealth and the power, the military that he could bring in for his own purposes.
He was massively in debt. He needed to create something new, yeah.
And also a lot of that money went back to Rome,
Right.
which made him rich, but also made Rome wealthier.
Right.
And it created a buffer zone between, Rome and the Italian city-states and the Germanic tribes,
The potential,
etc.
yeah, exactly.
People,
Potential enemies.
if the Carthaginians were going to try and get in again, they'd have, a buffer zone and also other resources that they'd have to, unless he came via sea, obviously. A lot harder for him to come over the Alps, though, if Caesar controls all of that area, or Rome controls that area. Same with Napoleon. Napoleon, in trying to keep all of the European monarchs at bay, was about trying to create friendly monarchs in all of these countries to provide a buffer zone for France, and also not so much to get the access to the wealth of those countries, although he did use armies from those countries as part of his overall armed forces that he could call upon.
Yeah.
When he wanted to go to Moscow, for example. 1812, went into Moscow with like 800,000 troops. Not all of them were French.
Right.
Very small portion of them were actually French. Most of them came from these allied countries that he had. Then if you look at what the United States has been doing since particularly World War II, when, after World War II, most of the other great powers were pretty much fucked.
Yeah.
Particularly England, never
Yeah.
really came out of it as strong as they were going into it.
Right.
If you put yourself in the shoes of, I'm not thinking about presidents or your Congress or your Senate so much, but if you think about the large corporations in the United States. What are the ambitions of large corporations? Large corporations typically want to increase their wealth and power.
Yeah, isn't there a saying, grow or die?
Grow or die, exactly. Yeah. So, they partly want to grow inside of the domestic market, but then, of course, they're going to be looking at international markets, and they want to grow their power and their influence in these international markets. They want to get access to the natural resources of these markets. They want to keep as much of the profit from that access as they can for themselves.
Absolutely.
Share as little of it as possible with anybody else, including the people of these countries.
Right.
So you end up in a situation as they're trying to expand into these other countries, the people of these other countries obviously have different ambitions and different incentives. They want to keep the wealth for themselves.
Right.
And you get into situations where you have various competing powers around the world all trying to carve up the resources of the world for themselves. So during the Cold War, you had the USSR and you had the United States with competing visions, political and economic visions for the world. And they were trying to get as many countries as possible into their sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And I don't think much has changed. I think the United States' dominance in the world is partly down to the wealth and the size of the military that the country has, but also how many countries can you get to be part of your thing as opposed to being part of the other thing.
The other guy's thing, yeah.
The other guy's thing. Right?
Well, I guess my thing is one of the reasons I like the podcast we've done is I've learned so much from Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. Everybody's out for themselves. Everybody's trying to get as big a chunk of the world as they can. It's just that the ways and means change. Now it's like between Vietnam and when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the new battlefield were corporations. The new battling entities were corporations. And ever since that and Bush and the invasions of the Middle East by us, it's truly back to now literally war. Conquest and not just business, but now you got business, big business, and war, real war combined, and that's just such a horrible mixture for everybody else, unless you own stock in some of these countries or unless you're in charge. And so, nothing's changed, and that's one of the things we want everybody to know. Everybody's out for themselves. Everybody wants the biggest piece of the pie as they can. Nothing's ever enough. Nothing is ever enough, which I still don't get, by the way. But it's just the ways it means have changed, and you just have to step back And when you're listening to the news, just step back and kind of filter that in your head and think about it. Do I need to believe this person? Why should I take what they're saying as face value? Because they're probably self-serving when they're giving me this message. I don't know. That's what I really like what we've done, because it just shows that nothing has changed in the last 2,000 years.
You know, Tony asked a good question over dinner last night, and you weren't there because you were praying to the white throne. Yeah, you were bowing down before the great white throne. But he said, "Well, who's the modern equivalent of a Caesar or an Alexander?" And we started to talk about, you know, it's not those sort of generals that became kings that are the modern equivalent. It's more the corporate leaders that are the modern equivalents of these guys. And, you know, I suggested somebody like a Rupert Murdoch, who is incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, has his fingers in lots of different pies in lots of different countries. Right. But, you know, if that is a reasonable analogy, in the modern world, your Rupert Murdochs can't have their own army to go out and force other nations to give them access to their resources or give them access to their markets. So they rely upon the armies of the countries where they have enough influence to be there on call if required. But you can't just say, you know, if you're a corporation and you want to get access to a foreign market and that foreign market isn't playing ball, they're saying, no, you can't get access to our natural resources or our people
because we don't trust you.
Or you need to pay this amount of money, and they don't want to pay that amount of money. You can't just dial up the White House and say, well, can you make your army available to me this week? I want to go and invade a country. That's not acceptable in a modern Western democracy.
Can't be that direct.
Can't be that direct, right? So, you know, you need to manufacture the conditions that will allow armies to go in under the auspices of, well, we're defending the people of this country, or we are removing a horrible dictator, or we are spreading democracy, or we're protecting this religious minority, or, you know... I think it's a lot more complex today than it was 2,000 years ago. You can't be as direct, as you said. And then I think, you know, we need to always remember what our good old friend Cicero said, cui bono. Who benefits from these things? And if you look at the invasion of Iraq, who benefited from that? Well, it certainly wasn't the Iraqi people. No, they've you know, I don't think they're having a very good run of it at the moment. But at least up until ISIS started taking control of large swathes of the country, certainly Western oil companies benefited a great deal out of America's invasion of Iraq. I saw one study a while ago that said pre-2003, most of the oil interests in Iraq were controlled by Iraqi national organisations, controlled by Saddam, probably most of them. By about 2009, 2010, the vast majority of the oil interests in Iraq were controlled by international corporations.
Someone else other than the people whose oil, you know. But I guess the modern interpretation of Cicero's saying is follow the money.
Follow the money.
That's right. That's what it all comes down to.
And that's not to say that every military involvement that America gets involved with is about money necessarily, but it's a lot more complex, I think, than most people give it. It's a lot more complex than people think it is.
Which is one of the reasons they probably don't delve into it too much, because it is complex, and who's got the time, and everybody's busy. You know, taking care of their families, working their jobs, and, you know, who's got the time?
Exactly. And if you look at, I mean, let's take some examples of things that people are relatively familiar with. If we think about the Cuban Embargo that's been going on now since 1960. You know, Obama has been trying to wind that down a little bit. What will happen when there's a new president and a new Congress, we don't know. But if you go back to the beginning of that, what happened? Well, Cuba before 1959 was run by a dictator, Batista, who was basically an American puppet.
Right.
He was supported by the Americans, and there was a lot of American corporations that were doing very well. United Fruit Company is the big one. That had a lot of operations out of Cuba. They were manufacturing a lot of stuff, taking back to the US. The mafia obviously had a lot of control of Havana, etc. as well, and it was the playground of both the mafia and a lot of wealthy Americans. When Castro took back control of Cuba for the Cubans, and kicked all of the American corporations out and said, no, you can't extract the wealth from this country and just move it offshore.
Yeah, it's not okay.
Yeah, because if you go back pre-1959 in Cuba, the levels of education, the levels of healthcare, the levels of poverty were very, very high.
Right.
The education, healthcare were low.
Right.
Poverty was high.
They were a lot better. Right.
A lot worse.
Oh, right.
A lot worse in Cuba under Batista.
Yeah.
And one reason for that is a lot of the wealth of the tiny island nation was going offshore. And as it had done even before the American involvement, when the Spanish were controlling the country for a century before that. So Castro wanted to keep the wealth inside of the country for the people, for the benefit of the people. At least this is what he claims.
Yeah.
I'm not claiming to know the truth of what Castro's agenda really was, but at least that was his claim then, and it still is now. And so the United States tried to invade a number of times. Now their justification for that at the time was Castro, bad guy, bad dictator. We want to get rid of him. But when you've had a situation where America's corporations have had a large interest in a place, they get kicked out. It kind of is easy to understand how they want to get back. They want their operations back. And, they were able to influence the federal government and the military and the CIA at the time. Yeah. First with, I think, Eisenhower and then with Kennedy to try and take it back by force. They failed. Their couple of early, like the Bay of Pigs invasion, failed. Yeah. Castro then did a deal with the Russians to get some nuclear missiles put there to say, hey, try that again, motherfuckers.
Yeah,
and
we have something.
It's all over. Then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right. Kennedy pulled right back and said, okay, well, we obviously can't. There's no option for a military solution to this anymore. They brought in the economic sanctions to try and cripple the country, again in an effort to destroy the people's revolution in the country.
Right. The resistance stuff,
which would then enable American control of the region to have a renaissance.
But when you have economic policies like that, the vast majority of the people that are hurt are the poor people who need as much as they can get. It's not the bigwigs. They're still going to be able to get food and nice things. It's the common person in Cuba that's going to feel it more than anybody else.
Yeah. And obviously, as a policy, it's been a complete disaster.
Right. It hasn't changed anything.
Yeah. And all it's done is harm the Cuban people and prevent Americans from smoking Cuban cigars. Right. So, if you look at that as a microcosm, as a small example of tracing what America's real interests may have been. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the correct interpretation of events, but I think it is easy to see that it's at least possible that America's agenda vis-a-vis Cuba had more to do with regaining corporate interests in the region rather than, they just dislike the idea of Castro running the place. But then, of course, in order to justify everything that they did, they had to paint...
And to package it up.
Yeah, they had to paint Castro as being this, crazy, corrupt, evil, mass-murdering dictator. Again, I'm not saying that that's true or false. Very hard, and I've studied the whole Cuba thing for 20 years. On one hand, you have the American propaganda. Then on the other hand, you have the Cuban propaganda. And I accept that both sides are probably trying to position it in a way that supports their interests.
Right.
You can't take either of them at face value. You have to try and look at it objectively, weigh up the facts as best as you can, and try and decide what's really going on.
And it's okay to say, I don't know, or I want to look at this, or I'm not going to believe everything that comes out of Washington. I mean, it takes a certain amount of courage, and Ryan and I were talking about this earlier. It takes a certain amount of courage to ask the questions. It's okay to ask the question. It doesn't make you unpatriotic. It doesn't make you evil. I mean, we have an entire the press, United States, their main job is not to give us the news. Their main job is to keep an eye on those who have power. That's their job, to report on these people. So it's okay to question, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it certainly doesn't make you evil. And it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. And we'd all be better off if we did ask more questions.
You really think that's the job of the media?
Question power? Well, they're all owned by the big corporations. I know that, but when you do get the big breaks where something gets reported, you're like, okay, at least someone every once in a while, maybe every 25 years or whatever, can call the government on it, that kind of stuff. So I'd like to see more of that, but they're all gobbling, the big corporations gobble up all these news agencies, and they just toe in the line like everybody else.
Yeah, but I think you're right that it's really important if you want to be an intelligent, participating member of a democracy, to be prepared to ask the hard questions of yourself, and not just to accept everything that you're told by your government at face value. My policy has always been that I don't assume that everything the government says is a lie.
Right.
I also don't assume everything that they say is the truth.
Right. And I should salute it every time they say something.
I think it's naive to just accept everything they tell you as being the truth. And we just know from reading history, ancient and modern, that governments and people in power lie constantly to protect their interests.
Yeah.
You never really know until long after the event when it was a lie, or sometimes it comes out. But I think it's naive to always assume we're being told the truth. To assume that everything is a lie probably makes you a fringe conspiracy theorist, paranoid neurotic.
Right.
So the truth is probably somewhere in between, and you have to constantly, I think, to be a good member of a democracy, you have to continually be skeptical about what you're being told by the powerful and the wealthy. And in a Western democracy, that's not just your elected officials; it's the corporations and not just business corporations, but organisations of all flavours. Religious organisations. Again, most religious organisations are very large, wealthy corporations in their own right. Catholic Church is worth trillions of dollars. Most of your big mega churches of every denomination have a lot of money, a lot of interests.
And they want to keep that going.
Exactly. It's natural for them to want to protect that. And if in order to protect their wealth and their interests, they need to tell some lies, then they're probably going to do that. And so you need to always be questioning it, and you need to be thinking about it in terms of, what is their real agenda likely to be. And then you have to understand, as you said, that the media, in most of its forms in the West, is owned by large corporations. And what are the interests of the corporations that own the media? What do they care about? Do they care about objective reporting of the facts?
The stock price.
They care about their stock price. The people that run the large corporations, what do they care about? They care about their salary, their bonuses, their wealth, their reputation, their career.
Clout.
So it makes sense to me, anyway, that they are always going to be trying to protect and grow their current wealth base. And if, in order to do that, they need to, tell some porcupines. They're going to do that. The same with a political party. The people that run large political parties want that political party to be successful. Why? Because then they will be successful. You know, if you are a lifelong member of a political party and you've worked inside of it for decades, your reputation, your self-esteem, your income, your lifestyle is all built up around that, and you're going to do whatever it takes
to protect that.
Yeah.
Right? Well, there's one thing that it's been with me ever since we did the show. We were doing the Alexander show, and it was after the first or second battle between Alexander and Darius. And Alexander, I can't remember the name, and I apologize. Alexander told someone else, or he wrote him a letter, that I was wounded or that I fought literally with Darius hand in hand. But we know that that never happened. So there was no reason for Alexander to tell that lie except for to make himself look bad or whatever. But if he's willing to lie about something, then everybody does it just on a different scale. But that just always struck me. He didn't have to say that because he won the battle. He already got whatever, was going to come out of that. He won the freaking war. So why lie, why tell little lies? But he was building himself up, and he was just trying to create an image of himself, but it wasn't true. And if he's going to lie about that, then who can you believe? He didn't get anything out of that.
If you can't believe everything that a guy who thinks he is a god says, who can you believe? Whenever I have these conversations on Facebook or in person, particularly in this country, or on podcasts, people come back and go, oh, you just hate America, or you think everything America does is evil, et cetera, which is inane nonsense. I don't think everything America has ever done or does today is bad or is evil. It doesn't work like that. Yeah. I don't think that America hasn't been responsible for many wonderful things in the past and still today. You're American and I love you.
Thank you.
My wife is American and I love her a little bit less than I love you, but
that's fine.
My son is American.
He's awesome.
All I'm trying to say is that it's not all good or all bad.
Right.
You have to have the ability to accept and recognize that when you run a world superpower, there are going to be times when that superpower does really heinous things, and not as an accident. Sometimes people will say, well, look, America isn't perfect and it fucks up from time to time, but usually they want to portray it as an accident.
Right.
And maybe sometimes that's true. Yeah. But I think it's also true that sometimes the heinous things that get done are done deliberately for agendas that aren't made available to the general public. Because let's take the Iraq invasion. If Bush, Cheney and Rumsfeld had said back in 2002, 2003, and to the lead up into the invasion, look, we're going to go and invade Iraq and we're going to bring down Saddam Hussein. And look, Saddam's a batshit crazy guy. We kind of put him in power and kept him in power for the last 20 years, but now we've decided we're going to get rid of him. But the real reason we're going to do it is because, he's not making his oil reserves. I think Iraq at the time was had the second largest oil reserves in the world. We want better access to that. We want cheaper access. We want more control over it because our oil needs are going up. And so we're going to go and we're going to spend $1 trillion invading the country. We're going to kill hundreds of thousands of people in the process.
And we're going to lose people ourselves.
Yeah. Also, our oil corporations can get more control of the oil. Also, so our military corporations can, bill the taxpayer hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in order to build new weapons and new bombs and stuff. Because, this is the great thing about the way war is run this country. America decides it's going to go to war. It's going to invade a country. So the first thing they do is go, oh, okay, well, all of the private corporations that provide your armaments, that provide your private military, your Blackwaters or XEs or whatever they are now, the people that supply all of those in the field, the construction companies that go in there and build roads and build forts, all of that's privatized.
Right.
These are private or private/publicly listed corporations. They want to get money to do all of these things. And when the war is involved, the money comes from the government to fund all of this. Okay, military corporations, we will go and buy $1 billion worth of new planes, jets, bombs, tanks, guns, whatever from you. Where does the government get the money from? The taxpayers.
Yeah.
So it's a very easy and quick way for all of these corporations to just reach out and grab billions, hundreds of billions of dollars straight out of the taxpayers and throw it into their revenues, which ends up as profits and bonuses and everything for the guys running these organizations. The Halliburtons that then go in and have to do reconstruction. Let's go in and bomb the fuck out of the country. Oh, okay, well, we better go rebuild it now. Who's going to rebuild it? Halliburton. Who's going to pay for that? The government. Where does the government get money from? The taxpayers.
Right.
If these corporations just said, hey, can you, hey, American taxpayers, can you give us $100 billion? You can't get away with that.
Right.
If you can create the mechanism for a war, for an invasion, it's a very quick way to get the taxpayers to go, oh, you need money for that? Sure, go ahead, take it with a blessing. Now, that money, of course, then isn't going into your education system. It's not going into your healthcare system. It's not going into your crumbling infrastructure in this country, roads, bridges, whatever that are falling over.
It'd be nice if the government said, look, we're about to declare war. Whatever extra money you got, go buy some stock in Halliburton or oil or military or whatever, and at least everybody could benefit. They don't say that shit. They just do it, but they know, where to buy some stock at.
But I think, again, getting back to what we've learned, the more you study the way that these empires run, as you said before, it's all about wealth and power, and you have to lie to the people in order to get them to either directly, back in the times of Caesar and Alexander, to directly go out there and put their own lives on the line.
Yeah.
Or in more modern times, for the people that aren't involved in the military, directly, although you still need to, create this whole propaganda around support the troops. They're this whole, they're doing service. Thank you for your service.
Right.
There's all this propaganda to make people in America feel good about either being part of the military or funding and supporting the military. And what are the military doing? They're really going out there and just, paving the ground for American corporations to go out and take control of the natural resources of all of these different countries. Now, sometimes it's directly and sometimes it's indirectly. For example, you still send Israel, I think, $3 billion a year in direct and indirect aid in terms of funding and military and that kind of stuff. So you're not sending troops over there, but you're funding their troops so they can then keep an eye on the countries in that region and destabilize a lot of the Middle Eastern area so they don't, I think it's so they don't. They're so busy fighting each other over there that they can't come together and lock down that region of the world even more. And then you have this whole interest where you have, as we said before, competing interests. So the US wants to control as much of the world's resources as possible. To make sure that the money from all of that goes into American coffers. B, to stop Putin, Russia or the USSR back in the Cold War from controlling it.
Right.
It's a big chess game. Everyone's trying to control as much real estate as possible so the other guys can't control it. And I don't know.
If I could go back to something you were saying, the troops go in first. They do what they got to do, and then the businesses go in. That's the way it's always been. So we're not saying it's good, bad. That's just the way it is. But that's like, how many times have we said the Roman soldiers were chased out, and when the bad guys come in, the barbarians or the Gauls, whoever, they killed all the Roman merchants. What the fuck are you doing there in the first place? So wherever you find soldiers, you're going to find businessmen right behind them, and that's just the way it is. I'm not saying good or bad. That's just the modus operandi of the world of capitalism, of making money, force, and then business.
And the reason we don't, it's not as obvious today as it was back in Caesar's day, is that the levels of sophistication of the propaganda now are far more complex than they used to be. In this country, in particular, the nationalist and patriotic propaganda is incredibly high. And I don't think most Americans really even recognize that. The fact that you get school kids to stand every morning and say a pledge of allegiance to the flag.
I remember doing that when I was a kid.
That doesn't happen in Australia. It doesn't happen in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a very, very high level of indoctrination and brainwashing the children from a very, very young age.
Yeah.
It was one of the Jesuit leaders, Ignatius, I think, who said, "Give me a boy at 7 and I'll give you the man." We all know that if you can brainwash kids at a very early age about a religion, or in this case about their country,
right?
It's basically Hitler Youth. That's the way I see the way that this gets done here. It's the same thing Hitler tried to do. You get the kids, you brainwash them at a young age, and you know, by the time they're 18, man, they've had 10, 12 years of, particularly at a time when their brains are, you know, very supple.
Right, still forming,
they're very young, they're very easily conditioned. You get them when they're young, and by the time they're adults, they can't think any different way. That happens in countries like this. So Chrissy and I talk about this all the time, about the fact that every morning she got up and had to say the Pledge of Allegiance as a kid.
Yeah.
Now, particularly after having lived in Australia for 6 or 7 years, she looks at it, she goes, "That is fucked up. Like, I can't believe they made me do that as a kid."
Yeah. But to even question it was evil, sin, and unpatriotic.
Yeah.
And those are like the 3 worst words you could use, you know, to describe somebody in America. So,
And patriotism, I find a very interesting concept. You know, this whole idea of...
Who said my country, right or wrong?
Neil Young? No.
Oliver Wendell Holmes, I think.
Yeah, right or wrong. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
My country, right or wrong.
Yeah.
So even if my country is wrong, what it's doing is wrong,
because
I'm going to support it. Is that what that means?
I guess so, yeah.
Ryan, you're an American. What does it mean, my country, right or wrong? How do you translate that?
I think you nailed it.
I mean, I look at it, and I'm not criticizing here. I mean, I love America. I've had a great time here. I love a lot of things about America. But, you know, from an outsider's perspective, I see a lot of this stuff, and I'm like, what the fuck is going on there?
We could be better. We could be better.
I'm wearing cowboy boots I bought in Wyoming. That's how much I love America.
Yeah. Buys his cigars from America.
I do, yeah. But this whole patriotism thing, I think it stops people from being able to think rationally.
Right.
And I think I think exactly that's what it's designed to do.
Right.
Putting your hand over your heart and looking up at a flag.
Yeah. It's a ceremony. It's almost a religious ceremony.
It is.
So
And it's designed in a way that if somebody comes along and says, you know what, you really need to question what your country is doing.
Yeah.
It attacks the individual's identity. It goes to their very core of who they think they are and what they think they stand for.
Because it's already been wound up in patriotism, yeah.
I've said this a number of times on the trip that, you know, I think all Americans should live for 5 years somewhere else in the world when they're young. Like when you're 20, just get out of the country, go live somewhere else for 5 years.
Yeah.
Then go back to the United States if you want, but you'll have a much healthier perspective on your country.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's a lot of Americans I meet say they've never been out of the country, let alone lived outside of the country. They don't even travel much. And when they do, they tend to stick in a little tour and they do some, you know, an American tour company takes them on a little American tour and then
they eat all the same foods they could have had in America.
Go to McDonald's and Starbucks and go back.
Exactly.
And again, I know there's a lot of Americans who don't do that. You know, and Chrissy would be going, "That's not me. Shut up." You know, I know that I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but I know there are a lot of very intelligent, very worldly Americans that do understand what I'm talking about. Yeah. Particularly, you know, if you listen to our show and you're still listening to it, you're probably not one of those people. Right. Although we have some that still feel this way. But here's the thing. I think being a good citizen requires of you that you constantly challenge what your country is doing.
And that's okay.
Is what we are doing ethical, moral, in the best interests of not only ourselves, but, you know, we're part of the global community. Right. Is what we're doing going to build a safer, more harmonious world? Or is what we're doing destroying the world or building enemies around the world that are going to come back and want to bomb us.
Yeah.
And you get yourself into a situation if you've been out there oppressing economically or militarily people of other countries decade after decade after decade. It's reasonable to assume eventually they're going to want revenge.
Yeah.
This is Mithridates of Pontus and wanting to get revenge on the Romans. It's Persia did it to Greece. Then Alexander wanted revenge, and then after Alexander had been was in Bactria and Sogdiana, the people there wanted revenge against Alexander for turning up and taking this stuff. Yeah, it is human nature.
Yeah.
If people are oppressed long enough, they're going to want to bomb the Twin Towers in 9/11.
Yeah.
You should expect that.
Yeah. No, we want our cake and eat it too. There was one thing a couple days ago we interviewed Stephen Saylor, his latest book, and there was one thing I didn't get to ask him. It's 88 BC. Mithridates is about to pull the plug on massacring all the Romans, and during his conquest, he runs across Rutilius Rufus. Rutilius Rufus was a governor out there who tried very hard to treat the people decently. He didn't take massive bribes, whatever. He just did the best he could. But he was very cosmopolitan in his outlook. He goes back to Rome and he gets tried because he didn't bring back enough money and other things. He literally gets tried and he gets exiled. So he goes back out there. So Mithridates, when he's going around getting ready to do this, he catches Rutilius Rufus, and you think the first thing he would have done would kill him. But he had heard about the reputation of how Rutilius Rufus treated the people, and he didn't kill him. He took him with him for a while. Eventually, I think he let him go. I'm trying to remember. But literally, this guy's reputation for fair decency and treatment was to such an extent, this bloodthirsty Mithridates did not kill him. We could have easily killed him. That's just amazing to me. You treat people decently, and that comes back and.
And conversely, if you don't treat them decently, they want revenge.
That's right.
The other story apart from Cuba that I always talk about is the overthrow of the government of Iran in 1953, I think, 53 or 56. So, I think we've touched on this briefly before, but it's worth people knowing about if you're not familiar with this story. So in the early 50s, Iran was an Islamic country, but it was a fairly modern democracy.
Right.
Kids were starting to listen to rock and roll. Girls were wearing mini skirts. It was, a very sort of secular, almost Islamic country. Not like we think of Iran or extreme Islamic countries today. And there was a very elderly guy called Mossadegh who was elected as prime minister of the country. President, prime minister, whatever it was. And one of the first things that he did was try to renegotiate the access to the oil that the British had negotiated with the Shah previously. Yeah. Because they'd had the Shah, basically the king of the country. He was a corrupt old fool. Basically did a deal with the Brits to give them access to the oil early in the 20th century when the Iranians didn't even really realize the value of oil. And the Iranians were getting like 0.1 cent of a dollar of the oil. And the Iranians were very poor and, all of this money was being removed out of their country.
Right.
So Mossadegh tried to sit down with the British and renegotiate the oil contract. He wasn't looking for all of it.
Right.
But he was looking for we want 5%, we want 10% of the revenues. You still get to keep the vast majority. We just need more money so we can build some modern infrastructure for our people. And the Brits told him to go fuck himself. So Mossadegh said, fine, okay, after trying to do this for a year or two, he said, fine, you know what, I've had enough. We're just going to nationalise the oil interests and we'll just keep it all. You don't get any of it. Now, if you're not willing to be reasonable and negotiate, I'm just going to cancel the agreement and we're going to keep it all. So then the British decided they were going to invade, but they didn't have the resources after World War II to do it by themselves. So I think Churchill at the time went to Eisenhower and said, help us invade. We want to invade Iran. And I think Eisenhower said, "Fuck you! Are you crazy?" I think Korea was ramping up, and we just got out of World War II. Not interested. But then what happened is MI6 went through the back door to the CIA, which was newly created in the mid-50s. It had come out of the OSS. So after World War II, the OSS, the Organisation of Strategic Services, had been created, and their job, the CIA's job, the OSS's job, purely was as almost to do daily reports for the president. They didn't have agents, they didn't have anything going on. Their job was purely to, do analysis of global intelligence and provide the president with briefings on, well, here's what's happening over here and here's what's happening over there. America had never really done that before. Because of course you were isolationist for most of your history, and you were now you were a superpower coming out of World War II because everyone else had been destroyed by World War II because World War II wasn't fought in the United States, it was fought in Europe and Russia, and of course Europe and Russia bore the brunt of World War II, and Turkey and places like that. So the CIA had been recently created, and MI6 went to them and said, hey, how about helping us overthrow the government of Iran? And the CIA said, sure, fuck, we'll do that. Yeah, why not? So under a guy called Kermit Roosevelt, they went over there, and basically he just had a big slush fund that he managed to get. And he went and started destabilizing the country. Managed to get a lot of criminal gangs to create riots in the street, and then bought the media, friendly media over there, and international media to say that the riots were actually communists and that Mossadegh was aligning himself with the communists and he was creating the violence in the streets.
Brilliant.
And they did this for a couple of years, completely destabilized the country to the point where, Mossadegh was weak politically. They then literally went in and sort of grabbed Mossadegh, removed him from the country, and installed the Reza Shah, the son of the former Shah of Iran, as the government of Iran. Now, they then supported the Reza Shah for 25 years. He was an incredibly corrupt, evil, villainous fuck who brutalized the Iranian people, but lived like a king and enabled the Brits and the Americans to get cheap access to the oil. What that led to was by 1979, the Iranians had had enough and they said, fuck you. And with the support of the Ayatollah Khomeini, they overthrew the Reza Shah and his government during what we call the White Revolution, which was the start of this extreme Islamic theocracy in Iran, which still exists to varying degrees to this day. Now, the hatred that the Iranians have had for the United States stems back primarily to their knowledge that the United States overthrew their government and installed the Reza Shah and then materially supported him for decades. Now, okay, so what was America's incentive for that military involvement? Was it that Mossadegh was a bad guy? He wasn't a bad guy. He was a lovely guy by everything I've read. He was a sweet old man that believed in his people and was trying to take care of them. Trying to build his country up by keeping some of the money in the country. It was all about money and oil. And even though the White House, wasn't behind this, the CIA was definitely behind it. Now, if you don't believe me, there's a bunch of books you can read. All the Shah's Men is a good book. Tim Weiner's book on the history of the CIA, it's called Legacy of Ashes, is another good book. Go read that. Tim Weiner's a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist. He's written a very big book on the history of the CIA, another one on the history of the FBI. Both of them are all based on, on-the-record sources. So these aren't conspiracy theory books. These are really, really hardcore acts of deep investigative journalism. So, when you learn more about these stories, and you can say, okay, well, that was 60, 70 years ago. That doesn't happen anymore. I've heard people say that, well, the CIA used to do those sorts of things back in the bad old days, but then, You had the Church report, the Church investigation of the CIA in 1975, and they cleaned it all up. And then George H.W. Bush came in and, as the director of the CIA, he cleaned it all up, and they don't do that kind of heinous shit anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that farcical.
They just stop doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're not going to do those sorts of things.
You caught us. We won't do it anymore.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I think you have to. And I guarantee you most Americans don't know that story of the overthrow of the Iranian government because it doesn't get talked about here. You don't get taught about that in school. Maybe if you go and do some sort of degree at college, learning about geopolitical history, you might. But, most people don't know what's going on.
They'll never know that story,
And so the more you go and you read about these stories and you think about, well, this is what America was doing in the late 20th century. When did it stop? If it stopped, how did it stop? How do we know, these sorts of things aren't still going on today?
Well, they've been going on since at least for 2,000 years, so they'll probably go on for another 2,000 years.
It's the nature of power. It's what people with wealth and power do. They want to protect and increase their power. And to think that American corporations are different, or that American political leaders who are funded, their campaign finances funded by these corporations, are somehow morally pure.
A cut above.
Yeah, it's just that strikes me as entirely naive.
Whereas when we rule the world through our podcasts, benevolent gods.
Filthy, dirty, benevolent gods.
What he said.
So what else have you learnt?
Oh, God. I don't know how to do this exactly, but I'd like to do a future podcast on pretty much everything we've been talking about. Power, the influence of power, the people seeking power, how it corrupts them, how they start to buy into their own propaganda. I mean, I would really love to know if at some point during Alexander's life, did he really start to believe himself other than just being a man? I mean, you say the words, you say the words, you say the words, and at what point have you hypnotized yourself? I mean, if he was like, I'm going to live a really awesome life, and then when I die, I'll be a god, I can almost get behind that. But at some point, I wanted to know if he truly started to believe he was something other than human, semi-divine, because that's when you're truly leaving reality, and you're going to make a lot of bad decisions. But you're going to be immortal or famous or all-powerful,
So you learnt that?
I just find all that interesting.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So what about future shows? What do you think we should do next, Ray?
Well, we could do the history of Christianity. I would have to leave America. We could do the history of Islam. I would have to never leave America. I don't know, what does that leave? I don't. Do you do the Powerful Man series? Because that's something that people can get behind and understand, and it's linear. Do you do an idea? Do you do a concept like the Cold War? That kind of thing. So there's just so many different ideas, but it's your execution of them that will determine if it's any good or not.
What are you interested in learning about through the course of a show?
Yeah. Well, just like we've been doing, the stuff behind the scenes that you never would have known if you hadn't dwelled into it. I'm fascinated by corruption, power, intrigue, the dealings that go beyond where people don't control as much as they think they control. It's already been determined by someone else. I just find that kind of thing fascinating, but sad, depressing at the same time.
One of the things that we've been talking about the last couple of days is the history of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Might be interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, for people of our generation, we were the first generation of, maybe the generation before us even. People who were born after World War II were the first generation of people to grow up with the knowledge that the ability existed to wipe out all human life on the planet.
And your enemy had that ability,
within, seconds.
Yep. That
we could have had this mutually assured destruction of global thermonuclear war. And that fear seems to have dissipated, post, the end of the USSR and Glasnost, even though there are still thousands and thousands of active nuclear warheads on the planet today.
Right. Yeah.
I think the US still has 3,000 or 4,000 active nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
Russia probably has a similar number.
Right.
Israel supposedly has some. India has some. Pakistan. And who knows when ISIS or ISIL or
get their hands on
any of these crazy motherfuckers get them. Iran claims not to be trying to produce it. But, I think that the whole Cold War thing is another interesting topic because, as we've talked about over the last couple of days, again, I think most people like us that grew up in the West were given this perspective on the Cold War that it was all about the Ruskies are bad and they're trying to spread their evil empire across the world. In the West, we're the good guys and we have to stop them.
Contain it, exactly.
Yeah. And as soon as you get a story like that, you should automatically be suspicious.
Yeah, that's just too cut and perfect.
But that's the same story that everyone's told their people since the dawn of time.
Yeah.
Alexander, the Persians are bad, we need to stop them. Caesar, the Gauls are bad, we need to stop them. During the Civil War, these guys, these are the bad guys, Romans, we're the good Romans.
Bad guys, that's all cut and dry.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of simplistic view of complex geopolitical events. When somebody starts trying to sell you that, you should, smell the bullshit straight away.
Go into cynicism mode.
Yeah, because it's obviously being dumbed down, and then someone is trying to sell you something.
It's being packaged, yeah.
So I think we can try and unpack the different perspectives of the Cold War. Hold on. I know people can see me texting, Ryan, but so now my cameraman is texting me to tell me not to stop texting.
The irony in that is...
Chrissy's texting me to say, you guys finished yet? I need to get into the room. So I'm sorry I'm texting, folks, but deal with it,
He does that during the
real
podcast,
life is
too.
going on here while we're recording.
How about our next episode?
I'm sorry.
Our next podcast should be about the different dives in Vegas.
I like the fact that Ryan texted me to tell me to stop texting. That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, Ryan. Yeah. So I think we can unpack maybe the Cold War. Same with the history of Christianity. Like I really, I enjoy the shows that we're doing now. We're going into them not knowing much,
right,
and then trying to unpack the story and figure out the different perspectives from the different historians and the original sources, and trying to work out our take on it. Not necessarily the truth, but what's our take on what was going on then?
Right. You have to clear up a lot of misconceptions, because I knew a lot about Caesar, which is why I said yes to you to do the show. But I learned so much more, and I was able to correct so many wrong ideas I had. And just to be able to go down to that level, it's just enjoyable to dive into something and just go through the process and share it with the people.
And share it. Like you and I could do that by ourselves, but then, then who are you going to talk to it about? Our wives don't care.
No.
Yeah, none of my friends care.
No.
I start talking about this shit back home and people's eyes just glaze over,
Yeah.
But if you guys have any ideas for future series, I mean, you send us emails and Facebook stuff all the time.
Actually, if you could take your idea and write it on the back of a $20 bill and send that to us, that'd be great.
Or just on the side of a box of cigars.
They're even better. Even better.
But, we've been talking about how we want to maybe step away from ancient history.
Right.
Do something a little bit more contemporary, a little bit more modern, a little bit more recent that maybe people are a little bit more emotionally involved in.
Right. Yeah, that's not... I mean, it's a little scary to say that, but it can make it more exciting, and there's nothing wrong with going in and examining something you think you already know, and just find out whatever's there and just accept it for what it is.
Well, or just, unpack it and try and work out, well, I have this perspective. Maybe there are other perspectives.
Let's go find out.
Yeah, let's go find out what the other perspectives are and see if they make sense to us, if we can understand them.
We're on a trek.
A
5-year trek.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about the Cuban Revolution, the Russian Revolution. A lot of these things, I think, would be interesting to dive into.
Yeah.
And I guess we want to find something that we can also make fun. Yeah. We don't want it to be too dry, too boring. Something we can continue to
have fun with.
Yeah. I think people seem to enjoy learning while having a laugh.
Right.
And a bit of a sing-song.
That's the way to go.
Yeah. And some filthy jokes. Not for everybody.
No.
We know that not everybody likes our sense of juvenile foul-mouthed schoolboy humour.
It takes all kinds. You just
that's
gotta
right.
go with it.
Turn it off. Go.
Yeah.
Listen to Dan Carlin. Go listen to something else.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
I think that's the end, Ryan. I think we're done. What?
No, I was just going to say, hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And if this is sexy to you, hopefully you were a little aroused during the last hour.
We can keep Ray sounding like this. We just need to, you need to keep supplying booze and cigars.
I don't ever want to see a cigar again.
Just to wrap up too, in Vegas, so this is our last thing in Vegas, as I said at the beginning. We have genuinely had a great time. All of the guys that came were fantastic.
Yes, awesome guys.
We got to, we worked harder than I expected to. I
Yeah.
thought we'd just be sitting around the pool.
Bit disappointed.
Yeah,
Let's not do
sorry
this
about
next
that.
year.
Yeah, well, if we hadn't taken 3 weeks off before we got here,
Yeah, that's true.
maybe we wouldn't have had to have worked
That's
so
true.
hard. But
Yeah.
we've tried to get some shows done. We've tried to spend some time with the troops. Tried to get out and have a drink and a stogie
And
around
we did
that.
it all. We did it all.
We managed to cram it all in, but save your pennies.
Next year.
And come next year. We might do it here. We might do it in New Orleans.
That'd be awesome.
New Orleans.
Yeah. No, it's
We might do it, who knows?
yeah.
Somewhere fun. Come and have fun, hang out. You'll learn, you'll laugh, you'll get a little bit excited.
Yeah.
You might even, you might even get laid if you're lucky.
Not by us, by somebody in the area.
Oh, we'll organise it for you. We'll hook you up.
Podcasting/pimping services.
And we want to thank Ryan again,
Yes, thank
our
you,
cameraman. All right.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.